Dr. Ethan Klein jolted awake as alarms blared through the cabin. The spaceship, Stellar Unity, shook violently, sending passengers tumbling out of their seats. Ethan grabbed onto the nearest railing, his heart pounding in his chest. Outside the window, stars spun in a chaotic dance, and the glowing surface of an alien planet loomed closer. Braced for impact, a voice yelled over the intercom. Before Ethan could react, the ship crashed. Metal screeched, and the world turned into a blur of sound and motion. When everything stopped, Ethan was sprawled on the cold, uneven floor, surrounded by debris. Groaning, he pushed himself up, his body aching but miraculously intact. The passenger cabin was in ruins. Sparks flew from exposed wires, and thick smoke filled the air. Ethan spotted other survivors, some stirring, others unmoving. Among them was Naira, an alien diplomat he had seen earlier during the journey. Her shimmering, blue-tinted skin and tall, slender form stood out in the crowd of mostly human passengers. Naira sat slumped against a broken panel, her breathing shallow. Her translator device, clipped to her collar, emitted faint, static-filled sounds. Ethan approached cautiously, mindful of her cultural reputation for distrust of humans. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice steady but urgent. Naira's dark, almond-shaped eyes fluttered open. She studied him for a moment before nodding faintly. "Minor injuries. My respiratory device. Damaged." Ethan examined the intricate apparatus attached to her. It was cracked, hissing softly as it struggled to function. Without it, Naira couldn't breathe the planet's atmosphere. "We need to fix this," Ethan muttered. His training as a doctor kicked in, pushing aside his fear. He rummaged through the wreckage for anything usable, finding a medical kit and pieces of the ship's machinery. Other survivors were waking, their voices rising in confusion and fear. Ethan called out, rallying those who could move to help the injured. The immediate priority, however, was Naira. If her device failed completely, she wouldn't survive long. "Stay still," Ethan told her, beginning a crude repair of the device. Naira flinched when he touched it but didn't resist. Her prideful silence spoke volumes. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Finally, the device sputtered to life, its usual hum returning. Naira's breathing steadied, and she gave Ethan a hesitant nod of thanks. Before they could exchange more words, the ship groaned ominously. A section of the ceiling collapsed, sending sparks raining down. The planet's harsh environment wasn't waiting for them to regroup. "We have to leave the wreck," Ethan said to the remaining survivors. "Find shelter before night falls." Naira pushed herself to her feet with surprising grace for someone who had been so close to death. "I will assist. This planet. Unfamiliar. Dangerous." Ethan nodded. He didn't trust her fully yet, but her knowledge might be crucial. Together, they began organizing the survivors. Though Ethan tried to focus, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The planet's dense jungle, visible through a cracked viewport, seemed alive, as if something was lurking just beyond sight. Leading the group outside, Ethan was struck by the alien world's eerie beauty. Massive trees with glowing, bioluminescent leaves towered overhead, their roots twisting like giant serpents. Strange creatures flitted through the air, emitting soft, musical chirps. But the air was heavy with humidity and an undercurrent of danger. "Keep moving," Ethan urged, his voice firm. "Stay close." Naira walked beside him, her sharp gaze scanning the surroundings. "This is not a natural world," she said quietly. "These structures, remnants of something ancient." Ethan followed her line of sight and noticed faint, geometric patterns carved into the rocks. They looked like ruins, half-buried and overgrown. But there was no time to investigate. As they moved deeper into the forest, the group came across a clearing. The sunlight, filtered through the glowing canopy, gave the place an otherworldly glow. It seemed safe enough for the moment. Ethan and Naira worked together to set up a temporary camp. She used her species' advanced knowledge to identify edible plants, while Ethan treated minor injuries among the survivors. Their cooperation was uneasy but effective. When night fell, the alien jungle came alive with sound. Unseen creatures howled and chittered, their calls echoing in the darkness. The survivors huddled close, their fear palpable. Ethan couldn't blame them. He felt it too. But he forced himself to stay calm. These people needed him, and he wasn't going to let them down. Neera approached him as he sat near the fire. "You are different from what I expected," she admitted, her voice soft. "Let's hope that's a good thing," Ethan replied with a tired smile. For the first time since the crash, Neera allowed herself a small, fleeting smile. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The night passed uneasily. The alien jungle echoed with strange noises, unseen creatures calling out into the darkness. Ethan sat near the fire, trying to keep it alive with the few dry branches they had gathered. The warmth from the flames was a small comfort against the heavy, damp air of the jungle. Neera sat across from him, her sharp eyes scanning the shadows. Her breathing was steady now, thanks to the repaired device, but her posture was tense. Ethan had never met anyone quite like her before, so composed, yet so distant. "We need to find more supplies tomorrow," Ethan said, breaking the silence. "Food, water, and a way to signal for help." Neera nodded without speaking, her gaze fixed on the jungle. She didn't seem afraid of the dark. In fact, she almost seemed to welcome it, like she was part of this alien world. The fire crackled, and Ethan glanced at the others, who were huddled in a tight circle around the fire, trying to stay warm. The crash had left most of them shaken and afraid, their confidence shattered. But they were still alive, and that counted for something. Ethan stood and stretched, his muscles sore from the crash. He knew they couldn't stay here long. The jungle was beautiful, but it was also dangerous. Every minute spent in this unknown place was another chance for something to go wrong. "I'll go gather more supplies," he said. "We can't afford to wait for rescue." Neera rose to her feet. "I will come with you," she said, her voice calm but firm. Ethan hesitated for a moment, considering her words. He had never traveled with an alien before, and the thought of being in the jungle with one made him uneasy. But he had no choice. They were stranded together, and their survival depended on working together. "All right," he said, nodding. "Let's move quickly. We need to be back before nightfall." The two of them set off into the jungle, their footsteps muffled by the thick undergrowth. The plants around them were unlike anything Ethan had ever seen. Vibrant flowers with glowing petals, trees with bark that seemed to shimmer in the light, and large vines that twisted in strange patterns. Neera moved with ease, her eyes constantly shifting from one point to another. She seemed to know exactly where to go, as if she had lived here her whole life. Ethan, on the other hand, was careful with every step. The jungle was dense, and the air was thick with moisture, making it harder to see and breathe. After a few hours, they came across a small stream that cut through the jungle. The water was clear, but Ethan wasn't sure if it was safe to drink. He knelt down beside it and used a small filtration device from his medical kit to test the water. "Safe," he confirmed after a moment, filling his canteen with the fresh water. Neera stood a few feet away, her eyes scanning the area, alert to any possible dangers. As they moved along the stream, Ethan noticed something odd in the distance. Movement, not from an animal, but from a structure. It was half hidden by the trees, but it looked like the remains of some kind of building. His heart skipped a beat. "Do you see that?" he asked Neera. She followed his gaze and frowned. "Yes, it is ancient, older than my species." Her voice held a mix of curiosity and caution. Ethan stood up, his mind racing. The discovery of an ancient structure was a huge opportunity. It might contain useful resources, anything from technology to shelter, but it could also be dangerous. They couldn't afford to be reckless. "We should check it out," Ethan said, his voice low but determined. "But we need to be careful." Neera agreed without hesitation, and they moved cautiously toward the structure. As they got closer, Ethan could see more details. The building was massive, made from large stone blocks covered in strange symbols. Vines and plants had overtaken it, making it difficult to tell if it was still standing or simply a pile of rubble. Ethan reached out and touched one of the blocks. It was warm to the touch, as if the stones had absorbed the heat from the sun. He ran his fingers over the symbols, but they made no sense to him. They were unlike any writing he had ever seen. Neera knelt down beside him, examining the markings with interest. "This is not human or Ilfar," she said softly. "This language, it's alien." Ethan stood up and looked around, his instincts telling him that they were not alone. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching them. Suddenly, a loud growl echoed through the jungle, sending a shiver down his spine. The sound came from behind them. Ethan spun around, his heart racing. A large creature emerged from the trees, a predator, with glowing red eyes and sharp, jagged teeth. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. The creature stalked toward them, its movements swift and deadly. "Run," Neera shouted. Without thinking, Ethan grabbed her hand, and they sprinted away from the creature. The jungle seemed to close in around them as they raced through the dense foliage, the growl of the creature growing louder behind them. They had to get back to the camp. Fast. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest as he and Neera dashed through the thick jungle. The ground beneath their feet was uneven, and the dense foliage made it hard to see. Every branch they pushed aside seemed to come back to slap them in the face, but they couldn't stop. The creature's growl grew louder, closer. It was gaining on them. "Keep going," Neera shouted, her voice steady despite the danger. Her long legs moved with graceful speed, but Ethan struggled to keep up, his human body not built for this kind of sprint through the wild. Behind them, the growl turned into a snarl, a terrifying sound that sent a chill through Ethan's spine. His breath was ragged, but he pushed himself harder, unwilling to let the creature catch them. He could hear the creature's heavy footfalls crashing through the underbrush, too close for comfort. How much further? Ethan gasped, his lungs burning with each breath. Neera didn't answer immediately. Her eyes were sharp, scanning the jungle ahead. "Not much," she said, her voice calm but urgent. "Just up ahead. There's a clearing. We can make a stand there." Ethan didn't need to be told twice. He pushed himself harder, his legs aching with every step. They reached a clearing just as the creature's snarl echoed again, much closer now. The clearing was small but had tall, thick trees around it, perfect for hiding. Ethan slowed to a stop, his chest heaving, and turned to face Neera. "We'll have to fight it off," Ethan said, trying to steady his breath. He wasn't a soldier, but he had learned enough about survival to know that if they didn't defend themselves, they wouldn't last long. "Do you have any weapons?" Neera didn't answer immediately. She had a strange calmness in her eyes, almost as if she wasn't surprised by the situation at all. She nodded once, and from beneath her robe, she pulled out a sleek, glowing dagger. The blade seemed to shimmer with a faint blue light. Ethan stared at it. "That's impressive," he said, taking a deep breath. "But we should try to outsmart it. No need for a fight if we can avoid it." Neera gave him a sharp look. "This creature is territorial. It won't back down. We need to be ready." As if to confirm her words, the creature emerged from the trees, its massive body looming in the entrance to the clearing. It was a horrifying sight, covered in thick, dark fur with claws long enough to rip through steel. Its red eyes locked onto them, and it growled, showing rows of sharp teeth. Its breath was heavy and filled with a foul odor. Ethan's mind raced. There was no running now, no time to hide. They had to fight, or they would be its next meal. "Get ready," he whispered, pulling Neera behind a large tree for cover. Neera's dagger glowed brighter, ready in her hand. Ethan had no weapon, but he could see a large branch nearby. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He grabbed it and held it like a club, his muscles tensed and ready. The creature circled, its eyes fixed on them, and then it lunged. Ethan barely had time to react. He swung the branch with all his strength, hitting the creature across its side. The impact made the creature stumble back with a roar, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it seemed more enraged. Neaira moved with speed, her dagger flashing in the light as she lunged at the creature's side. She struck quickly, her blade slicing through the creature's thick hide. The alien weapon glowed with power, leaving a faint trail of light in the air as it cut deep into the beast's flesh. The creature howled in pain and swung a massive claw toward Neaira. Ethan didn't think, he just acted. He rushed forward and slammed the branch against the creature's side, distracting it long enough for Neaira to roll out of the way. The creature, now injured, turned its attention to Ethan. Its massive jaws opened, ready to snap shut. But Ethan was quicker. He ducked to the side, avoiding the snapping jaws by mere inches. He swung the branch again, striking the creature's face. This time, the creature staggered back, its eyes wild with pain and fury. The creature seemed to hesitate, momentarily confused by the combined efforts of the two of them. It circled them, growling low in its throat, but didn't attack immediately. Ethan could feel his heart racing, and he knew they couldn't keep this up for long. They were both getting tired, and the creature was relentless. "We need to finish this," Neaira said, her voice calm despite the chaos. She looked at Ethan, her eyes sharp. "Distract it. I'll go for its throat." Ethan nodded quickly, not sure how they were going to do it, but trusting her plan. He moved to one side of the clearing, shouting at the creature to get its attention. The beast snarled and charged at him. With a deep breath, Ethan jumped out of the way, narrowly avoiding the creature's deadly claws. At the same moment, Neaira darted forward with surprising speed. Her glowing dagger cut through the air, and she drove it into the creature's neck, right at the base of its throat. The creature let out a final, ear-splitting roar as it collapsed to the ground, its life fading away. Ethan stood panting, sweat dripping down his face. Neaira stepped back, wiping the blood off her dagger. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The clearing was still and silent, save for the sounds of their heavy breathing. "We make a good team," Ethan said, a grin breaking through the tension. Neaira gave him a rare smile, her eyes gleaming. "We do. But next time, I'll handle the creature." Ethan laughed softly. "I'm not sure I'll argue with that." The jungle was quiet once more, but their victory felt like a small triumph in the face of the many dangers still to come. They couldn't afford to relax. There was still much to do if they were going to survive on this strange alien world. The silence that followed the fight with the creature felt strange, almost unnatural. Ethan and Neaira stood in the clearing, both catching their breath. The beast lay motionless on the ground, its once glowing red eyes now dim. Ethan wiped sweat from his forehead, his mind still racing from the intensity of the battle. "Are you all right?" Neaira asked, her voice calm but tinged with concern as she studied him. Ethan gave her a tight smile. "I think I'm fine. Just never thought I'd be fighting giant alien predators today." Neaira didn't return the smile, but her eyes softened. "You did well. You kept your focus. Many would have panicked." Ethan nodded. Her words gave him some comfort, though he wasn't sure how much of that fight he had actually handled. Neaira had been the one to finish it off, her blade striking with precision and skill. "Thanks," Ethan replied, feeling a bit humbled. "That was impressive, what you did with that knife." Neaira simply nodded, her expression unreadable. She seemed to be studying the creature as if it were a puzzle she was solving. After a moment, she looked back at Ethan. "We should move. It's not safe here for long," she said, her voice practical. "There could be more." Ethan agreed, and together, they gathered their things. The clearing had felt like a safe place in the midst of danger, but now it felt like a trap. They couldn't afford to stay too long. The jungle around them was alive with noises, small rustling sounds from the trees, faint calls in the distance. But after the attack, Ethan felt even more aware of how fragile their position was. "Where are we headed?" Ethan asked as they moved, stepping carefully over the rough terrain. "There's a ridge," Niera said. "We can see much farther from there. We might be able to spot any approaching threats, or even a possible escape route." Ethan trusted her judgment. He had no idea where they were, and in truth, neither did she. The crash had thrown everything into chaos, and now they were both just doing their best to survive. Every step they took seemed to lead them deeper into the unknown. The trek was slow. The jungle was thick with trees and vines that seemed to grab at their clothes and pull them off course. Ethan's arms were scratched from the thorns, and the humidity made the air feel thick and suffocating. Still, Niera moved with ease, her steps sure and confident. Ethan couldn't help but admire her resilience. After what felt like hours, they reached the ridge. It wasn't as high as Ethan had hoped, but it was enough to give them a clearer view of the surrounding area. The jungle stretched out in all directions, an endless sea of green. In the distance, there were mountains, their peaks barely visible through the thick clouds that hovered above. "Do you see anything?" Ethan asked, squinting into the distance. Niera stood motionless, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon. It was impressive how she could pick out details from so far away. But then again, she was no ordinary person. She was Ilthar, from a species that had evolved in ways that humans couldn't even imagine. "There," Niera said after a long pause, pointing toward a large clearing several miles away. "There is something there. A structure. It could be another ruin, or perhaps a settlement." Ethan felt a spark of hope. They had no idea what kind of civilization or technology the aliens might have on this planet, but a settlement could mean resources. It could mean help. "Should we head there?" Ethan asked, feeling his exhaustion begin to fade at the thought of a potential safe haven. Niera turned her gaze toward him. "Yes, but we must be cautious. It's likely that it's not a safe place. If it is a settlement, it may be occupied." Ethan nodded. "Got it. We'll stay low, keep our distance." They began to make their way toward the structure, moving carefully and quietly through the jungle. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the land. The world felt different in the fading light, more mysterious, more dangerous. As they neared the clearing, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The structure grew larger as they approached. It was different from the ancient building they had found earlier. This one was smaller, but its design was more sophisticated, angular, sleek, and made from materials Ethan couldn't identify. It stood in the middle of a large open space surrounded by tall grass. The air around it seemed almost charged with energy, and there was a hum, faint but constant, coming from inside. Ethan's curiosity pulled him forward, but Niera held him back with a firm grip on his arm. She motioned for him to stay silent and still. Her senses were alert, scanning the surroundings with the precision of a trained hunter. "Something's not right," she whispered. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "Wait," she said, crouching down, her eyes narrowing. He followed her lead and crouched as well. From their position, they could now see figures moving around the structure. They were humanoid, but their movements were stiff and mechanical, almost robotic. They wore armor that reflected the fading light, making them look like shadows of the night itself. "They're not human," Niera said, her voice low. "But they're not Ilthar either. There's something else entirely." Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine. Whoever or whatever these figures were, they weren't friendly. And now, they had to find a way to avoid them. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he crouched beside Niera, hidden in the thick underbrush. The humanoid figures moved with unsettling precision, their glowing armor reflecting the last rays of the setting sun. They didn't speak, but their every movement seemed coordinated, as if they were part of one unified force. "Who are they?" Ethan whispered, his eyes fixed on the figures. Naira remained silent for a moment, her sharp eyes never leaving the scene in front of them. She had a look of concentration on her face, trying to make sense of the unfamiliar beings. Finally, she spoke. "They're not from this planet," she said quietly, her voice calm but filled with concern. "I don't recognize their design or their movements, but I've seen their type before." Ethan glanced at her, confused. "What do you mean? You've seen them before?" Naira's gaze shifted toward the figures once more. "Not exactly, but their armor. It's similar to the machines my people encountered when we were in the midst of a war with an enemy race. The machines are used for enforcing control, managing resources, and ensuring order. They are relentless." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. These weren't just ordinary beings. They were some kind of enforcers, and they were on the hunt for something or someone. But what did that mean for him and Naira? "We can't stay here," Naira muttered, her voice low. "If they spot us, we're dead. We need to move quietly." Ethan nodded, his mind racing. They had no choice but to move. Their only hope was to avoid detection, but with those figures so close, the odds weren't in their favor. They carefully backed away from the clearing, moving through the underbrush with silent steps. Every crack of a branch or snap of a twig seemed impossibly loud, but they pushed forward, determined to stay out of sight. They needed to get far enough away before making any decisions about their next move. As they made their way back toward the jungle, Ethan couldn't help but glance back, the silhouette of the armored figures still visible in the distance. The hum of their machinery filled the air, creating a tense atmosphere that made it impossible to relax. If these enforcers were indeed like the ones Naira had described, they would not stop searching until they found whatever they were looking for. Ethan's thoughts turned to the structure. What was it? And why were these beings surrounding it? Was it a base of some kind? A research station? The question swirled in his mind. But for now, the answers didn't matter. They needed to survive first. "Do you think they've seen us?" Ethan asked quietly, still keeping his voice low. "I don't think so," Naira replied, her sharp eyes scanning the jungle around them. "But we need to keep moving. The longer we stay in one place, the more likely it is that they'll find us. They're methodical. If they're looking for something, they'll sweep this area clean." Ethan didn't need any more encouragement. They picked up the pace, moving farther from the clearing and deeper into the jungle. The terrain was rough, and it was getting harder to navigate through the thick foliage. Yet every step forward felt like it was taking them away from danger. The sun had nearly set, casting the jungle into a dim twilight. The thick canopy above them blocked out most of the remaining light, and soon it would be nearly impossible to see. "We need to find shelter for the night," Naira said, breaking the silence. "We can't keep moving in the dark. It'll be too dangerous." Ethan nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. His body ached from the constant movement, but he didn't have the luxury of slowing down. They had to find safety, and quickly. As they continued their journey through the jungle, Naira suddenly stopped, holding her hand up in a gesture that told Ethan to be quiet. Ethan froze, his senses on high alert. He could hear the soft rustling of leaves, but there was something else, a faint, rhythmic thumping sound, like the beat of a drum or the pounding of footsteps. "Do you hear that?" Ethan whispered. Naira's eyes narrowed, and she motioned for him to follow. They moved slowly, carefully toward the source of the sound. After a few tense minutes, they reached a small clearing, where the sound grew louder. Ethan's breath caught in his throat when they saw what was causing the noise. It was a creature, but unlike any animal he had ever seen. It was large, almost the size of a horse, with 4 powerful legs and a thick, armored hide. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and its body seemed to hum with energy. But the most startling thing was its mechanical appearance. The creature's skin had a metallic sheen, and it seemed to be part organic, part machine. "This is what I feared," Naira whispered, her voice tense. "It's one of their patrols. a biomechanical construct designed for search and destroy missions, if they have these kinds of creatures on their side. Ethan's heart raced. They were dealing with more than just humanoid enforcers. These beings had machines, and if the patrols were anything like the one in front of them, they were nearly unstoppable. "We can't stay here," Ethan said, his voice urgent. "We need to move now." But Nyera didn't respond. She was staring at the creature, her expression unreadable. "I can distract it," Nyera said suddenly, her tone determined. "You run to the right. I'll make sure it doesn't spot you." Ethan's eyes widened. "No, we fight it together." "No," she interrupted, her voice firm. "I'll handle this. You can't risk getting caught." Before Ethan could argue, Nyera was already moving. Her body moved with swift, fluid grace, disappearing into the shadows of the jungle. Ethan had no choice but to obey. He turned and sprinted in the direction Nyera had indicated, his heart pounding as the sounds of the mechanical creature's movements filled the air behind him. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest as he ran through the jungle, the sound of the biomechanical creature's thudding footsteps growing louder behind him. He could feel the ground shaking beneath him with each powerful step the creature took. Nyera had already given him a head start, but it was hard to shake the feeling that he was running out of time. His breath came in ragged gasps, and the jungle seemed to close in around him. The thick trees and vines made it difficult to maintain any kind of speed, but he pushed through, his eyes fixed ahead, focused on Nyera's instructions. She had told him to run, and that was exactly what he had to do. He glanced back over his shoulder, but there was no sign of Nyera. The creature was still behind him, its mechanical limbs crashing through the underbrush, tearing apart anything in its path. Ethan's legs burned with the effort, and every muscle screamed for rest, but he couldn't afford to slow down. Not yet. The jungle seemed endless, stretching out in all directions. Ethan couldn't make out the sounds of the creature anymore. Had it stopped? Was it still following him? Every second felt like an eternity as he pushed forward. His only thought was survival, getting as far away from the creature as possible. After what felt like forever, he finally saw a break in the trees up ahead. There was a small hill with a cluster of large rocks at the top. It wasn't much, but it would provide him with some cover. Without hesitation, Ethan veered toward it, hoping to find a place to catch his breath and plan his next move. He scrambled up the rocks, his hands slipping on the wet surfaces, but he managed to reach the top. He crouched low, hiding behind the largest rock he could find, and listened carefully. His heart still pounded in his chest, but he tried to calm his breathing. The jungle around him was quiet, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He strained his ears, listening for the telltale sounds of the creature or any signs of Nyera. Time felt like it was standing still as he waited, unsure if his decision to flee had been the right one. Minutes passed, then hours. The sun had nearly set, casting a dark shadow over the jungle. The air grew cooler, but Ethan couldn't bring himself to relax. Not yet. Finally, he heard the soft crackle of leaves. His heart skipped a beat. He pressed himself even closer to the rock, holding his breath. The sound grew louder, and then, from the shadows, he saw her, Nyera. She moved silently through the trees, her silhouette barely visible in the dim light. Her movements were swift, fluid, and purposeful. Ethan felt a rush of relief seeing her again. She was safe. She spotted him immediately and gave a slight nod, signaling that it was safe to come down. Ethan didn't hesitate. He climbed down from the rocks as quickly as he could, moving carefully to avoid making any noise. "Did you lose it?" Ethan asked in a whisper as he reached her side. Nyera didn't answer immediately. She was scanning their surroundings, her sharp eyes constantly moving, as though she expected the creature to appear at any moment. After a long pause, she spoke. "It's still out there," she said quietly, "but it's not following us anymore. For now, at least." Ethan let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. "So, we're safe." "For now," Nyera repeated, her voice calm but serious. "We need to keep moving, though. Staying in one place too long is dangerous." Ethan nodded. They couldn't afford to rest for long. They had to keep moving, find shelter, and figure out their next step. He still didn't know what these biomechanical creatures were or what they wanted, but he knew one thing for sure. They weren't going to stop hunting them. "We need to head toward the structure," Neira continued, her eyes scanning the jungle around them. "If we can reach it before they regroup, we might be able to find answers." Ethan agreed. The structure seemed like their best hope for survival and answers. It was the only lead they had, but as he glanced around the jungle, he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. The jungle wasn't just a dangerous place, it was alive with threats. Neira turned and began moving, her steps light and careful. Ethan followed, staying close behind her. They couldn't afford to make any mistakes now. As they continued their journey, the sounds of the jungle grew louder. The faint calls of unknown creatures echoed in the distance, and the rustling of leaves became more pronounced. It was like the entire jungle was awake, watching them. They moved quickly, knowing they didn't have much time before nightfall. The dense canopy above them blocked out most of the stars, and the jungle felt darker by the minute. Ethan's mind raced with questions about the creatures and the mysterious structure, but no answers came. They didn't speak much during their walk. Neira's focus was entirely on the path ahead, and Ethan's thoughts were consumed with the dangers that still lay ahead. What were those creatures, and who was controlling them? He had so many questions, but one thing was certain: he was alive, and he was determined to stay that way. Whatever these beings were, whatever challenges lay ahead, he wasn't going to give up, not with Neira by his side. As they continued through the jungle, a faint light appeared in the distance. It was the glow of the structure, still miles away, but it was a sign that they were on the right path. "We're almost there," Neira said, her voice steady. Ethan nodded, his resolve strengthening. They were close, but he knew that getting there was just the beginning. What waited for them at the structure could change everything. The night air was thick with tension as Ethan and Neira continued their journey through the jungle. The light from the structure in the distance seemed like a faint promise, but it was still far enough to make them anxious. The path ahead was unclear, and the shadows of the trees felt like they were closing in around them. Ethan kept his eyes on Neira's back, following her every move. She moved silently, almost as if she were one with the jungle, her eyes constantly scanning their surroundings for any signs of danger. The biomechanical creatures could be lurking nearby, and the last thing they wanted was to be caught off guard again. After what seemed like hours of walking in near silence, they finally arrived at the clearing. The structure loomed ahead, its silhouette just visible in the dim light. It was an imposing sight, a mix of ancient and futuristic, with strange markings running along its metallic surface. The air around it felt charged, as if the building itself was alive. Ethan stopped for a moment, his breath catching in his throat. He had no idea what they were walking into, but he knew one thing: they had no choice but to go inside. They needed answers. They needed to understand who or what was controlling the creatures, and what role they played in all of this. "Are you ready?" Neira's voice broke through his thoughts, steady and calm. Ethan nodded, though the uncertainty in his gut didn't fade. "Let's do this." They cautiously approached the entrance, a large set of doors made of some kind of metal that shimmered faintly in the moonlight. There were no visible handles or buttons, just a smooth surface that seemed to react to their presence. As they stepped closer, the doors slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a dimly lit corridor inside. Ethan stepped forward first, his senses alert. The air inside was cool, almost sterile, and the silence was overwhelming. They moved cautiously, the walls of the corridor lined with strange symbols and glowing lights. The structure felt ancient, yet advanced at the same time. It was as if it had been abandoned for centuries, But the technology inside was far beyond anything Ethan had ever seen. "Stay close," Neera whispered, her voice barely audible. "We don't know what's inside." Ethan followed her, the sense of unease growing with each step. They walked deeper into the structure, and the walls seemed to close in around them. There were no windows, only smooth surfaces and low hums from the technology that lined the corridors. It felt like they were moving deeper into the heart of an unknown world. They reached a large chamber, and the door slid open to reveal an enormous room filled with strange devices and glowing screens. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and atop it, a large floating crystal. The crystal glowed with a bright, pulsing light, casting an eerie glow across the room. "This is it," Neera said, her voice filled with awe and fear, "the heart of the structure." Ethan approached cautiously, his eyes fixed on the crystal. It looked almost alive, its light flickering in a way that seemed too deliberate to be natural. There was something familiar about it, but he couldn't place it. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. "It's a power source," Neera replied, her eyes never leaving the crystal. "But it's more than that. It's a beacon, a signal to the other machines, to those creatures." Ethan's mind raced. "So, this thing is controlling them?" "Not exactly," Neera said, her expression darkening. "It's not controlling them directly. It's calling them here, directing them to this planet. And it's been doing that for a long time." Ethan's mind began to piece together the puzzle. The creatures, the biomechanical enforcers, the patrols, they were all connected to this crystal. It was like a beacon, a signal that brought them to the planet. But why? Who created this? Ethan asked, still not understanding the bigger picture. Neera hesitated before answering. "My people encountered these beings once. They are not native to this planet. They came here from another world, and they set up this structure as a way to establish control. They were searching for something, and they believed this planet held the key." Ethan's stomach twisted. "What are they looking for?" Neera's gaze turned cold, her voice hard. "Power. And they think the key to that power is buried somewhere on this planet." Ethan felt a chill run through him. If these beings were as dangerous as Neera said, then finding that power could mean the end of any hope for survival on this planet. "We need to stop them," Ethan said, his voice firm. "We can't let them get whatever it is they're after." Neera nodded, her face set in determination. "Agreed. But we can't do it alone. We need to destroy the crystal. Without it, the machines won't be able to find us." Ethan looked at the glowing crystal, unsure how they could possibly destroy something so powerful. But he knew they had no choice. If they didn't stop it now, the creatures would continue to hunt them, and others, without mercy. "Let's do it," he said, his voice steady. They had come this far, and they weren't going to let fear stop them. Together, they approached the pedestal. Neera reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she touched the crystal. The moment her fingers made contact, the room seemed to vibrate, and the light of the crystal grew even brighter. Then the ground shook. The hum in the air grew louder, and the door to the chamber slammed shut. The machines were coming.